if we just take the area of devices for measuring our own health, like Fitbit, of which is just one of many. As you probably know, when Tanya Sweeney, who was head of research at the FTC at the time, decided to look into what was happening with the data gathered on that type of device, she found that up to 80 or 90 unnamed corporations were taking that data. None of this was explained to the people who just wanted to track their heartbeat and whether they were running, whether they were getting ready for the marathon the right way. No one told them about what was happening with that data. And that's where dispossession comes in, because somehow the right to say what happens with data that you might or might not want to decide actually matters to you isn't there with you. You bought the device, and then somewhere behind the scenes, your right to that to control the flow of information about your life and about your body, which is all we have in the end, has suddenly been magicked away.
Thanks you guys so much for coming on our podcast. We really appreciate it. So you guys, how did you get onto this idea, you know?
Well, wait a minute. What idea? Let's give the audience a little help.
Data colonialism is what we call it. Colonialism in the field of data. Yeah.
Right. So how do you even begin to unpack that? Like, is it that data's been collected for a long time and it's looked at in one way, and then you say, well, hey, let's take a step back and look at it a different way?
That's a pretty good way of starting it. Yes. It's a reframing of all the debates about data,
right?
Not just capitalism, but something that has gone on much longer, which is colonialism.
Now, were you surprised at what you saw in there? Like when you first, you didn't know what you were going to see, and then as you started to see it, you saw something different?
Well, I think both Nick and I have been trying to do critical thinking about what's happening with data for a while. But yes, I think eventually we landed on this notion of colonialism as a way to try to explain not just what's been happening in the last 30, 40 years, but trying to put it in a context of what's been happening through a history of 500 years, a history of extraction and dispossession. So our basic argument is that while the original form of colonialism grabbed land and grabbed resources and human resources, this new form of colonialism that we call data colonialism grabs us, our social lives, our social interactions, our everyday interactions through this medium of data.
When you say it grabs our everyday, how does that manifest? What's the expression of that?
Well, we'll come on in a moment to how this works exactly. The way we put it is in terms of data relations, which are a bit like Marx's labor relations. They're a fundamental type of relation, this time involving the extraction of data. But go by one step back from that. What we're saying is our life has suddenly become a territory for exploitation. And this is a very subtle thing, but it is profoundly new. Let's just step back 30, 40 years. Corporations had the dream of ruling the world for sure. That's not new. We'll come back to where that came from maybe in a moment. But they couldn't get to us. They could only get to us through their ad campaigns. They knew we weren't paying attention. Maybe they could see whether we smile when we pick up the cereal bar or whatever. We might send them a message. That's all they had. That's really all they had. Governments knew a lot more about us at that time through surveys and things. There was a dramatic Gestalt shift around 25 years ago when it was corporations who started having more data about us than governments. And that's intensified because corporations, and the key turning point that Zuboff points out is obviously around 2005 with Google's exploration of the value of its data with its search algorithm and Facebook following. They discovered they had a domain of data, which was so rich and so deep, it amounted to almost something like a total knowledge of us based around continuous tracking. Now that many people say this is just more of the old same corporate domination, but we think of it as a phase shift, a really profound shift. And there's only one historical moment that's remotely parallel to that. And that we identify as the moment round about 1500, when two countries in Europe discovered the whole world was there for the taking.
Right.
They couldn't get their heads around it for a few decades. They gradually did, and that was the beginning of what we know as historical colonialism. That's the core of it. I hope that.
So when you say that, it used to be that colonialism would be you go to a certain place and take over, a certain country. Is this the idea that you're taking over? What's the manifestation of the idea of colonialism now?
Well, it helps to think about it in terms of kind of like the rationality or the justifications that were developed to explain how all of these things work. So in the book, which is called The Cost of Connection, basically we explain it through a progression going from cheap nature. If you think about it, in order to colonize the world, nature had to be rendered as cheap. It was supposed to be abundant. It's just there for the taking. That's what allowed Europeans to arrive to new discovered lands and say, okay, this is empty, it's inhabited, it now belongs to us. Even if it's inhabited by people who are not really civilized. So it's actually part of our mission to bring civilization and salvation, perhaps. So that's cheap nature. Then the next step was cheap labor. In order to transform nature into wealth, there were certain kinds of human beings in colonialism. It was mostly determined by race, as we know, that were meant to provide that labor. And now, so we're saying we go from cheap nature to cheap labor, and now we have cheap data. And if you think about it, some of the same characteristics apply. Cheap data is supposed to be free. It's supposed to be abundant. That's why people say data is the new oil. It is imagined as this kind of resource that's just lying there without an owner. Now, yes, you and I produce it and generate it, but collectively it needs advanced technology to process it, just like oil, just like other natural resources. So we are told that this is what progress looks like, that our job is just to generate all of this data, and we should let the big corporations do something valuable with it. So that's kind of how we explain this progression in the way of thinking, going from nature to labor to now cheap data.
No, corporations are using data to exploit people financially. Maybe modify a behavior, but it's all around their earnings. At the end of the day, that's what a corporation's trying to do. Do you disagree with that?
Not at all. No, it's certainly part of what they're trying to do. That's one manifestation of this.
What are other, when we talk about big data, what are we thinking about beyond money that they're trying to do?
Well, I think you have to think of the corporate imagination. We think there's been, as I said, a Gestalt shift 20, 30 years ago. It's really locked in the past 10 or 15 years. Any new business today needs to capture the data, not just its internal corporate data, measuring sales figures, measuring stuff on the production line, which they're entirely, entitled to collect. That's internal stuff. But measuring the world outside, measuring how we feel about their brands, how we behave when we're on their websites and so on. This is so taken for granted now. But what it is based on is observing everything we're doing, is taking the flow of our lives and just tracking it for corporate value. Now, you might say that's innocent. It just helps to personalize the products. And that's certainly what most corporations say when they make the offer. But would you think about that this is just the start of a much bigger extension? So kids in school today, if they're relying on products in the classroom, which are provided by ed tech companies, they're being surveilled the whole time. Now, teachers always watch their students, but there's always somewhere in the back of the class where they could do what they did, or in the playground or whatever. There are always those freer spaces. That was part of the life of the school. Now those spaces are much harder to find because education is itself based on continuous tracking of the flow of everything the kid does in school. That's just one example of how you've changed the model of extraction. So it's much more multidimensional, omnidimensional. And in fact, marketers now talk about omni-channel data extraction.
No, if I'm serving up ads and they're truly effective, then every single ad, that I would serve up would be, I would sell something. And, a lot of corporations have all this data and they think they have a model that's going to be totally successful, but they're not, because people are complex. So they might buy a certain product or do a certain thing. So what's the proper way to sort of gauge this new oil and what it means?
Yeah, well, that's a good point, Jesse. And, maybe we should actually give you the definition of data colonialism as we presented in the book, because we say that it is an emerging social order. It is something that is right now, we're seeing it progress and advance. And this social order is based on the premise of continuous extraction of our data from our social lives for one purpose mainly, which is the generation of profit, which you mentioned earlier. So we're not against all data. We're not saying data is bad. The weather report is good data that we use on a daily basis. We are specifically talking about this extraction of data, continuous extraction from our lives for the generation of profit. So you're right that, we've always had advertising and that's how corporations work. But the terrain, if you will, the frontier, to put it in colonial terms, of what's available for analysis and capture is becoming larger and larger. So now it's not just about the advertising, Jesse. It's also about the fact that when we watch those advertisements on our phones or our computers, there are, for example, cameras that can track our facial expressions to see if what kind of response we have to the ad. So it's becoming a surveillance state, as other scholars call it, where every single aspect of our life is being tracked and measured and used to the extent that some corporations are saying they can predict our behavior with very high percentage of certainty. It's not just a guess anymore, based on what we like on Facebook, based on what we search for, based on who our friends are. They can actually predict our behavior and determine what we will do, next week, or what kind of products we might be more amenable to buying.
When you think about the land grab, though, and you have competitive interests, so two corporations are coming at you, and you're getting, what is the war between those corporations, and are they doing anything more sophisticated? Are they one-upping each other? Because we're really talking about a financial profit in the way that you're speaking about it. So what happens between the two corporations, or the two land grabs, if you will?
Well, they compete, they intersect. So in the home today, you've got Amazon trying to get in there by giving free Echoes with other devices. They just discount sale. They would like to install the Alexa device in your home so that you get used to having your voice tracked and various aspects of your private daily habits monitored to, we assume something is done with the data. We assume there's some value in that for Amazon. It's inconceivable they'd be going in this direction otherwise. Google, meanwhile, is competing in the same house. I guess most people don't have a Google Home and Amazon Prime. They probably go for one or the other free product. But one way or the other, these two large corporations are going in similar directions. And that's why I stress the point about imagination. We're not saying necessarily that these attempts to grab our lives are entirely successful for making profit or for targeting us perfectly. Of course, as you said, Jesse, human life remains too complex. But there are a lot of marketers who have high hopes of getting pretty close to plumbing out complexity. So they may or may not be successful, but it's the act of the imagination we're most interested in. After all, the original colonies 500 years ago came as almost as a surprise, an accident. They wanted gold, but the idea of conquering the whole world was not the plan necessarily. But suddenly it became possible, and they had to imagine the rationale in the court of Spain for how what they were doing was rational, could be defended in front of God. And they came up with the notion of the civilizing process. Something else paradoxical is happening here, that for perfectly good reasons, often for just incremental corporate expansion, personalizing the ads, suddenly marketers, and they're just part of this picture, are in the position to grab our whole life, our flow of our life, the way we're feeling about this product where we've got wrapped around our wrist. This is a big change. And we really want to register this change and see it in terms of its deeper historical resonances. And that's really where colonialism comes in.
Now, when I first was, going over this, I was thinking that you were referring to disparities, in physical communities. Do you see a difference in what you're getting in terms of the data with, underserved populations?
For sure, because I think one very important point here to keep in mind is that the impact, the effects of this data colonialism are not evenly distributed. To paraphrase William Gibson, there are certain populations who are feeling the impact, the effects more. And guess what? Those are the same populations that for 500 years have been feeling the impacts of colonialism. So when we talk about disparities when it comes to gender, race, and class, for sure, there are certain populations who pay a heavier cost of connection, so to speak. The environment also, is an area where we can see that very heavy costs can be accumulated if we don't pay attention to what's happening in this new emerging data order. So it's very important to keep in mind that even though we're all involved in this new order, different populations are impacted differently.
How are the different populations, are they left out of getting things? They don't have connectivity. What is how does it express itself?
In some ways, the problem used to be that they were not included. Now the problem is that they are in fact included in this new social order because it's cheaper for them to be included and to surrender this data as the cost of getting a cheaper phone or using a free service like Facebook. So there's lots of examples that we could cite. For instance, when it comes to artificial intelligence, it was recently discovered that an algorithm that was used by hospitals and insurance companies was racist, was discriminating against black people because it was recommending more healthcare for white people than for black people. So that's something that had actual human costs. So that's the way the differences work.
In that example, it's bad inputs, give you bad outputs, no?
To a certain extent, yes, but it's also the problem that there are no regulations whatsoever. So if you want to design an algorithm, you don't have to right now, prove to any agency that your algorithm is not racist. There are no mechanisms to ensure that if that happens, how are you going to make reparations? So it's in some ways also like colonialism in that it's a wild west, an open frontier, where corporations have a lot of leeway to do whatever they want.
And this is a global problem, right? This is just everywhere, correct? Is there
It's
anywhere where they're regulating, or are they really trying to work on this, or no?
Well, there are differences between Europe, which has tried to regulate aspects of this with the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. Some specific European countries are trying to make progress. Korea is trying to make some progress, and so on. So that's uneven. But in a sense, it's a global problem because this new corporate horizon of grabbing human life is spreading across the world. It's a goal. It's not spread everywhere yet. The technology isn't always there in every single country, but it is a goal. And we see it in the visions of global business, World Economic Forum, and so on. But I just want to pick up on something Ulysses said and what you were saying, Jesse, that you can say this is bad data leads to bad algorithms, bad training data trains the algorithms the wrong way, they function wrong. That's clearly part of the problem. And it's actually the part of the problem that has been most focused on within the industry for obvious reasons. But there's another level that we also want to get at, which is if you are, let's say, in low paid work. Let's say you're a delivery worker. You're almost certainly going to be consistently tracked. Have you got there yet? Why haven't you got there yet? How are you driving? And so on. This is now the norm of working class life, or really middle class life, as you prefer to say in the United States. It's the norm. There is not much escape from that because managers now depend on those inputs. Now that, however good or bad the algorithm, is still a form of power, which is a massive shift, a change in the conditions of work, which is also part of this datafication we're talking about. It's really the idea that managers have the right now to put a machine on your dashboard if you're a driver and track everything you do. Or insurers are actually trying to do this to offer you more personalized premiums. Goes beyond the question about algorithms to a change in the whole capture of the terrain, which is where, again, the colonial phrasing comes in. And it particularly affects those in lower paid jobs who, of course, very often are Black. They're in other disadvantaged ethnicities. They may be women and so on, or the working class and so on. So the history of historical colonialism, that legacy goes on. It doesn't disappear, but it's now playing with a new colonial land grab, which is reinforcing it and locking it in ever more tightly into the social fabric.
Artificial intelligence is like a bucket that we just throw everything in and it doesn't have a definition and we don't know. I mean, it's like, who's artificial intelligence? What is it, right? And, lately you've seen, just reading the news, you see that Facebook has stopped, having followers, which means that for whatever reason, people are no longer responding to the product. And you see with things like TikTok, you have this, everybody's, it's got this mad rush to be on TikTok. So if you think about time, does it mean that there's some way that we can start impacting this problem? The regulation thing doesn't seem to have worked very effectively anywhere. It seems like we have to try and get the incentives right, or how would we start to unpack this problem,
Well, part of it is, as you're suggesting, market forces. And yes, Facebook 10 years ago was viewed in a one particular way. These days, obviously, they're losing customers, and I think people are much more skeptical of what they do. At the same time, there are new platforms like TikTok, like you said, that are gaining dominance, mostly based on, yes, these algorithms that suggest things for you to view in order to hook you in, to keep you engaged with the platform. I wouldn't be so quick to dismiss regulation. I think we can still do a lot in that area. And we definitely need to put pressure on our governments to come up with better regulations, not just at the point of, okay, oops, this algorithm was found out to be racist, how do we solve it? But even at the design stage, so that the people who design these technologies can think about, how they need to meet certain standards so that the technologies don't have a negative impact on society. But beyond regulation, there are lots of things we can do. I mean, I'm a boring college professor, so obviously my answer is always more education, and more public education, that's one.
Right.
But I think at a cultural level, I think we are hopefully starting to see a movement of people starting to ask questions. I see it in my classroom. 10 years ago, my students were like, Facebook's capturing my data. So what? I'm not doing anything illegal or improper. These days, they're starting to ask questions. So I think it's going to be a cultural movement that's going to require imagination. And that's always been the case with colonialism. When colonialism wasn't resisted through the body, it was always resisted through the mind, because colonialism also colonizes the mind, not just the body. So this idea that we need to be more creative about how we respond to this system, I think it's going to be crucial.
And what do we think about going even further? Because you've got corporations, but we also have governments that are, I mean, that's the real dangerous when you think about the end game here. And governments knowing everything and tracking, and the sort of the resistance, if you will, and the intelligence of the individual to start to say, not accept those cookies, or go through on your phone and, start to work through it, right? Is it a movement that can grow from individuals spreading around and saying, because we're never going to go back, we're going to probably keep going forward. We're going to have our phones and our computers. So are we looking for a kind of a worldwide movement of such that we still can contain our individualism and yet still be part of a system? There's a lot of good things that come out of data. How do you think about that?
Well, certainly we're probably unlikely to give up our phones or the internet, that's for sure. But we've got to remember that the problems that we're talking about, this possibility of grabbing our lives, depends on certain contracts. One contract is the business model that certain big platforms, Facebook and Google and whatever, have been operating on, which is depend on continuous surveillance. They could have other business models. It's not a given that they have this business model. They took a while to evolve those business models after all. We're also seeing a bit of a shift within the marketing community. There's been a massive kickback against the idea of cookies and the continuous tracking. The European Union is planning legislation to ban cookies. Google and Apple are moving back, although it's not clear whether they're actually trying to increase their own competitive position with their own advertising. So that's a complicated one. So there are signs of a shift that are going on. But again, the key is in terms of imagination. It's going to take 10, 20 years to build this shift, but then it took 10 or 20 years to get to where we've got to. So we don't have to go back too far in history to imagine a world without the infrastructure we have today. You're right that the position of governments may be one of the things that gets people's attention. So the Snowden revelations in 2013 were obviously fundamental in opening up a whole lot of this. But the key paradox of Snowden's revelation was that this was about government piggybacking on what corporations were already been doing, and no one had been complaining. And yet people complained about the government, which was slightly back to front. So I'm not sure you say that the real threat is governments. Well, it depends on the government you're talking about. With certain governments that say the government of Syria today or Russia or whatever, clearly that is a terrifying threat we're talking about there. But governments and corporations have always worked together throughout the history of colonialism. That's the given, because we're talking about a fundamental shift in the very nature of power. How could they not be working together? So we don't necessarily see governments as the answer. Depends, again, what you're talking about. But we have to take this corporate land grab seriously, because it's core to the business models today. And we're not sure it's what any citizen ever voted for or ever wanted. And we really have to allow ourselves to think about a different future for business, which is not based around tracking human beings throughout their life and undermining their dignity, as we see it, their freedom to live the lives they want.
Can we, like when we think about colonialism now, it's very clear, you can tour, I've been in Africa many times, you can see it. I can tell you what it is, and we see it. Here is one of the challenges, trying to get the metaphor across to people to understand what they're dealing with, because we just start talking about it and they don't necessarily know what's at stake. Is that part of when you say the imagination, Nick, is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think it is true that whenever we start talking about colonialism, some people have a hard time sort of connecting it. It's like, well, if you're talking about historical colonialism, where is the violence, for instance? Colonialism, as we know it and as we study it in school, was a brutal, exploitative, very violent system. So people ask us, are you saying that just by using Facebook, for instance, I'm engaged in the same kind of violence? And so our answer is no, we're not making a one-to-one comparison. Historical colonialism had very different modes and intensities depending on where in the world you were talking about. It varied because the colonialism in Brazil was very different from the one in India, for instance. But we're saying that there is one very important similarity. It's not the form or the content, it's the function. And that function is, again, to extract, to dispossess. So that's the function that establishes some continuities that we're interested in exploring, in looking at what that looks like today in this new form of data colonialism.
When you say dispossess, what do you mean?
Well, basically, as we were talking about the land grab that happened in colonialism, even though that land might have belonged to somebody else, the idea that a European person could arrive and claim it for themselves, say this land is empty, they even had a legal concept, terra nullius in Latin, which means no man's land. So the idea that I can just grab something that doesn't belong to me, or to even just conceptualize private property, to conceptualize the world as a series of, territories that can be acquired. I think that includes a level of violence that is a form of dispossession, of taking something that doesn't belong to you and claiming it for yourself.
If I could give even a more practical example, Jesse, because I sense you're wanting us to make this as concrete as possible. But if we just take the area of devices for measuring our own health, like Fitbit, of which is just one of many. As you probably know, when Tanya Sweeney, who was head of research at the FTC at the time, decided to look into what was happening with the data gathered on that type of device, she found that up to 80 or 90 unnamed corporations were taking that data. None of this was explained to the people who just wanted to track their heartbeat and whether they were running, whether they were getting ready for the marathon the right way. No one told them about what was happening with that data. And that's where dispossession comes in, because somehow the right to say what happens with data that you might or might not want to decide actually matters to you isn't there with you. You bought the device, and then somewhere behind the scenes, your right to that control the flow of information about your life and about your body, which is all we have in the end, has suddenly been magicked away. That's why we use the word dispossession. It might seem paradoxical. Once we get into the nuts and bolts of what's going on today, it isn't so paradoxical. Yes, there's not immediate violence. But then again, if we go back to some of the class patterns we were talking about today, let's suppose your work is involved cleaning houses. So you only get your work through what comes through an app, where the next job comes up and you've got to be watching that app. Otherwise, you're going to lose the money that you desperately need by the end of the day. Your behavior is going to be tracked. Whether you get there on time is going to be measured. That's for sure. You're not in control of the flow of that data either. And that can have an almost violent effect if you're literally depending on whether you're going to get food at the end of the day in terms of whether you obey the terms of the app. So that's where what seems nonviolent can accumulate to something pretty much like violence, and is always a sort of dispossession.
Can you go back once more on the Fitbit, though? Jesse and I have them, and we were using them, and we were, sending them out to the company. But just 80 other corporations that you didn't know. Could you just give an example of who else was getting that information and how that could be negative?
Sure. I don't remember that this research was done about 10 years ago. I don't have a list of the 80 companies. This was a
It'd be like a company that does heart rate monitoring, something like that.
It could be what the data. There are companies who could get value from that data, may or may not be anonymized, right? You're not in control of that. So my point is there about dispossession. You have lost that control. You might want that control. In fact, why wouldn't you want that control? It's data about your own body. But we've got used to the idea we don't have that control, and that's where the dispossession.
One question, I want to go back to something you mentioned, dignity, and we care about that and we think about that a lot here. And so, is that what it is that things are happening? I don't really know what's happening to me, and I'm being in some way exploited in a way, really when we talk about personal things or tracking Apple Health or, any of these things. Could you just define that a little bit further? I think it really struck me, and I want to
Sure.
understand a little bit of your
It's
thinking there.
important, and it's a subtle aspect of this. And maybe I could answer it just by stepping back again a second. Jesse, you were talking about the fact that when you go to an African city, you see the immediate effect of 500 years of colonialism. It's palpable in the nature of the streets, everything. Of course, that's right. So it's important to emphasize that we're comparing the beginnings of a new phase of colonialism that's operating on a new modality, which is data, just to the beginning of it, just in the first 10 or 15 years, with the end or 500 years into the historical colonialism. So as Ulysses said, there's bound to be a dislocation. We're not comparing like with like. So we have to allow for that when we try and make the point-to-point comparison that we're doing, which is about still this dispossession going on. That's the absolute core here. What we're saying is that if we go further down this path, if we just accept the assumption that our lives are just there to be tracked, there's value to be made out of them, there's no reason there should be any barrier to any corporation tracking us at all times, we've stepped over a threshold here. And we get to that by looking at some philosophers, paradoxically, like Hegel, who was one of the great celebrators of the historical colonialism and said some appalling things about it, but also a profoundly anti-colonial philosopher like the Mexican Enrique Dussel, who argued that the very possibility of freedom is based around the material structure of the self.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that we have one body, it's going to die in the end. It's the body through which we are aware of the world. It's our only means to be aware of the world. And we're not free if there's always a little machine inside our head tapped into an external corporation saying, well, you thought that, you sweated at that point. Maybe you're interested. Maybe you like that person, and so on. We're starting to step over that threshold where our freedom has something in between that interferes with it. Hegel said that our freedom is the freedom to be with oneself in the other. The in the other is the social world, but the freedom to be with oneself is the sense that when I think about, do I love this person? Am I ready to die? Am I fearful of what's happening? No one else knows until I tell them. That's mine. That's what I have. That's my space of the self. But the idea that we will be progressively trapped in that space, that, in our view, does offend human dignity. It goes to the very core, the space of the self is the basis of freedom. We may not be quite there yet, but we feel we're going down that track.
There's more data around than there's ever been, and there's so much data, it's almost impossible to analyze all the data. We talk about artificial intelligence, but, really we're talking about semantic search engines, for the most part. Do you feel like there's a trade-off between this state that we're in and some greater thing? I mean, I have to think that this generation is, the best minds of this generation have been sucked up by search, which is like, ridiculous, right? So, but it's like, is there a trade-off? Or is there something coming from all this data that is going to benefit mankind, womankind? Is there something in there?
Well, yes, I think it's important to also point out that you are correct. When we generate all of this data, it's not like there's a human being sitting there looking at it, because like you said, it's just a lot of data. That's why we have artificial intelligence, and companies are increasingly relying on algorithms, on machines to analyze that data. As far as what's going to happen in the future, I think what we also say in the book is that we're not trying to perfectly describe what's happening now or what's going to happen in the future, because in some ways we see this new stage of colonialism as what happened during the older colonialism through plantations, which generated a lot of the wealth that then allowed the factories to emerge. So colonialism really was necessary in order to have industrial capitalism. First, you needed the wealth accumulated in one to have the other. Mm-hmm. Likewise, we're saying, who knows what all of this wealth being accumulated right now by companies like Google, by Facebook and Amazon, who knows how that wealth will transform the world? It's already having an impact for sure, but it's very difficult to guess how exactly it's going to influence what happens, 50 years from now. And one other point I wanted to make to Priscilla's point, that yes, dignity is an essential component here, but the other difference with historical colonialism was that, again, that system was very brutal. This new system requires our participation, and in many ways it's our willing, consensual participation. There are certain elements of violence, but at the end of the day, we're all clicking the little box that says, I accept, I consent to my data being used. We might not read those terms of service, but we are clicking that box. So the system requires our participation, and we willingly participate because it gives us convenient things, because it gives us new gadgets and fancy things that in some cases might make our life easier in the short term without understanding how it might have negative effects at a larger level.
Are you guys optimistic for the future?
Well,
Irrespective of Ukraine, let's not talk
I
about
would
Ukraine. Let's
say-
not talk about the pandemic, just in general.
I think it's clear that we can imagine positive uses of data for sure. So I was thinking in response to your question just now, Jesse, that we obviously can imagine a much smarter use of regular data inputs on the physical environment, which will enable all of us to be more conscious of how we have to change our lives. Clearly, we could imagine some interface that would attune us to how we need to change our lives. That would be super positive. That's a very long way from what's actually happening, because what's actually happening more often is so banal, but it's profound. So I was just looking today at insurance. Insurance used to be about like a risk product that if something out of the blue, super bad happened, you were protected.
Mm-hmm.
No way was an insurer interested in tracking you in between the bad moments in your life.
Mhm.
Didn't know anything about them. It might do some broad demographics, but that was it. However, now, as you know, there's something called black box insurance, where you have a black box in your car, and the insurer, in return for more flexible premiums, has the right to surveil you everything you do in that car. It's pretty obvious that is a change in the nature of power.
Yeah.
Insurers are now surveillance operations. They're policemen. They're not providers of a risk product. That is a big change. And that's not a good change, because something to do with our dignity, our freedom, our ability to make mistakes. You could say the same with education. Going to school was about doing a lot of dumb things a lot of the time and making some terrible mistakes. But at least there's no history of it, and no one was creating a permanent archive and judging you for that every moment. That notion of education is being destroyed by ed tech. This is a sort of subtle institutional dislocation that we're building unless we challenge it. But we can challenge it, because we can see this change itself depends on a new way of thinking about education, which maybe we can challenge. We can resist this. So this isn't what education should be. This isn't what even insurance should be. And that's what we have to start doing. And then we're optimistic if we can do that.
When you look at the actuary tables on insurance, do you see this colonialism in there?
Well, I'm no expert I'm not an actuary. We know that there was a history of racial bias in insurance in the 19th century. Dan Balk did a wonderful book about this a year or two back, and finding that in those days, Black populations in the United States actually contested that, because the correlations between race and higher premiums were pretty damn obvious. So they did challenge it. Now it's not at all easy to find the correlations between your very particular demographic and lifestyle, etc., and the precise, secretly higher premium or lower premium that you're being offered. This is totally opaque.
Yeah.
So it's not challengeable in the same way, but there's always been a racial bias to insurance industry. That's not changing for sure.
So Ulysses, when you're teaching your students, right, what is the gateway to the imagination, so that, you know, how do you speak about this to young people who have grown up in a way just sort of already indoctrinated into this sort of way of being?
You know, I don't like to tell my students what to think. I try to avoid that as much as possible. So mostly I listen to them. And that's why I was saying that it's been quite interesting to see the way the conversation has shifted. Now, I'm not just a passive listener. Obviously, I do try to interject my own ideas. But I think what's interesting is to hear them speak about what's happening in their lives. You know, I give them the readings about what Facebook is doing, what Amazon is doing. And like I said before, they were like, well, so what? But now, many times, they react angrily or with concern and saying, wait a minute, I did not agree to this. This is not okay. I don't want to be tracked in this manner. And then, of course, I engage them in that discussion. What can we do about it? Is it just the role of the government? Is it the role of parents as they educate their kids? What will be their role as they enter to work into some of these corporations and try to change things from within? And we are seeing, thankfully, you know, workers in Google, workers in Amazon starting to speak up and ask questions even internally and say, are we okay with our companies doing this? So I think it's slow change. It's going to take time. But to bring it back to what's happening in the classroom, in my opinion, that's a very powerful moment to try to get young minds to think about the kind of world that they are going to create and in which they're going to live in.
Fantastic, gentlemen. Thank you for sharing all of this with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's a fascinating subject.
Scary. It's scary. I saw that Nick was optimistic-ish, but we all have a lot to think about. Thank you so much for the work that
Yeah.
you're doing. It's really important, and it
Yeah.
needs to be out there.
Thank you,
Thank you
guys.
very much.
Scary.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Really interesting, though.
It's not. It's frightening. It's not
It
interesting.
is.
It is. I'm just to think about though data as as a land grab. I mean, obviously
Yeah.
it's obvious, but the way that they've kind of talk about it is
Yeah.
really
Yeah, it's very, very important subject that doesn't get a lot of people talking about it, but it was fascinating. Well, I'll see you in the next one.
Bye.
Adios, amiga.